A city of whispers. The year is 1414, and the roads leading to Constance are thick with dust and anticipation. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the creaking of wagon wheels, the soft thud of hooves on packed earth, the murmur of voices speaking in a dozen different tongues. Perhaps you've felt this yourself, that electric tension before a crucial meeting when everything you've built hangs in the balance. The merchants arriving in Constance carried that same weight, their purses heavy with coin meant for the thousands who would soon gather here. But beneath their eager chatter, something else stirred, something unspoken. The city walls of Constance rise from the shores of Lake Constance like ancient guardians, their stones weathered by centuries of alpine winters. As dawn breaks over the water, the first travelers of the day approach the gates. Their breath forms small clouds in the crisp morning air, and you can smell it now, that particular scent of a medieval city awakening. Wood smoke from countless hearths mingles with the earthy aroma of the lake, the sharp tang of leather and metal from the guards, and underneath it all, the faint sweetness of bread baking in the early morning ovens. The guards at the gates have grown accustomed to the steady stream of arrivals. Cardinals in their scarlet robes, their entourages trailing behind like crimson rivers, bishops with their pointed mitres catching the morning light, scholars clutching leather satchels filled with precious manuscripts, and everywhere the rustle of parchment, the clink of coins, the whispered conversations that stop abruptly when strangers draw near. This is no ordinary gathering. The Council of Constance promises to heal the great wound that has torn through Christendom for decades. The papal schism that has left the faithful with not one pope but three, each claiming divine authority. The weight of expectation hangs over the city like morning mist over the lake. But in the narrow alleys between the timber-framed houses, where the shadows linger longest, other conversations unfold. Hushed voices speak of reform, of corruption in high places, of a Bohemian scholar whose ideas have already set Prague ablaze with controversy. The merchants selling their wares know to listen carefully. Information, after all, can be more valuable than gold. As you walk these cobbled streets in your mind, feel the uneven stones beneath your feet. Hear the distant tolling of church bells marking the hours, and sense that peculiar tension that comes when powerful people gather in one place, each carrying their own agenda, their own hopes, their own fears. The Council of Constance is about to begin, and history itself seems to hold its breath. The gathering storm. On November 3rd, 1414, a modest figure dismounts from his horse at the gates of Constance. He wears the simple robes of a scholar, not the rich vestments of a prince of the church. His name is Jan Hus, and in his leather pouch he carries something precious, a letter bearing the seal of the Holy Roman Emperor himself, promising safe conduct. Perhaps you know that feeling of walking into a room where your reputation has preceded you. Hus feels the weight of curious stares as he makes his way through the city streets. Some whisper his name with reverence, others with barely concealed hostility. The Bohemian reformer has come to Constance not as a supplicant, but as a man convinced of his cause. His lodgings are modest, a small room in a house near the cathedral, its windows overlooking the bustling square below. The walls are thick stone, cool to the touch even in the afternoon sun. A simple wooden table serves as his desk, and upon it he places his most treasured possessions, his worn copy of the Scriptures, a quill that has written countless sermons, and that precious letter of safe conduct. Emperor Sigismund, tall and imposing with his carefully trimmed beard, had seemed sincere when he granted that protection. "Come to Constance," he had said, "and speak your truth. Let the council hear your words." The emperor's own agenda was complex. He needed the council to succeed, needed the papal schism, resolved to legitimize his own authority. But surely, Hus reasoned, truth would find a way to flourish in such an assembly. The council hall itself is a marvel of medieval architecture. Imagine stepping into that vast space. Your footsteps echo against the vaulted ceiling high above. Rows upon rows of wooden benches stretch before you, arranged in careful hierarchy. The cardinals sit closest to the front, their scarlet caps like drops of blood against the pale stone walls. Behind them, the bishops in their white rochets, then the abbots, the doctors of theology, the representatives of universities from across Europe. Tall, arched windows line the walls, and through them streams the filtered light of late autumn. Dust motes dance in those golden beams, and you can smell the accumulated scent of centuries. Old wood, beeswax candles, the lingering trace of incense, and something else. The particular aroma that comes when hundreds of men gather in one space, each carrying the weight of momentous decisions. At the front of the hall stands a raised platform where the most senior cardinals sit. Their faces are maps of political calculation, eyes that have seen the rise and fall of popes, hands that have signed documents reshaping the Christian world. When they speak, their voices carry the authority of centuries, but also the weariness of men who have compromised too often in the service of power. The early sessions buzz with possibility. 3 rival popes have torn the church apart. One in Rome, one in Avignon, one in Pisa. Each commands the loyalty of different kingdoms, different universities, different armies. The council's first task is clear. Somehow this assembly must convince all 3 to abdicate, then elect a single, undisputed successor. But even as the council fathers debate the papal question, other currents swirl beneath the surface. The English delegation, led by men who remember the teachings of John Wycliffe, speaks quietly of needed reforms. The French, ever suspicious of Roman authority, pursue their own agenda. The Germans, hosting this gathering, watch carefully as their emperor navigates between competing factions. And in the midst of all this political maneuvering, Jan Hus waits. He has come to defend ideas that strike at the heart of ecclesiastical power. The notion that the Church's authority comes not from papal decree, but from Christ alone. That salvation comes through faith, not through the complex machinery of indulgences and priestly mediation. That the Scriptures, not tradition, should guide Christian belief. In the evenings, as the council sessions end and the great men retire to their comfortable quarters, Hus returns to his simple room. By candlelight, he writes letters to his followers in Prague, his quill scratching across parchment with quiet determination. "I trust in God's providence," he writes, and the words seem to glow in the flickering light. Truth will not be silenced forever. Outside his window, the city of Constance settles into night. Taverns fill with the talk of delegates and their servants. Merchants count the day's profits. Guards walk their rounds along the walls. And somewhere in the darkness, the future of European Christianity hangs in the balance, waiting for the morning sun to illuminate choices that will echo through the centuries. The gathering storm is about to break. A scholar's resolve. The bells of Constance mark the rhythm of Jan Hus's days with their ancient bronze voices. Matins at dawn, prime as the sun climbs over the lake, terse as the morning sessions of the council begin. Each chime seems to count down towards something inevitable, though what that might be remains hidden in the November mist. In his modest lodgings, Hus has established a routine that speaks to the discipline of a lifetime spent in study. He rises before dawn, not from restlessness, but from habit, the same habit that once carried him through his student days at the University of Prague, when he would light his candle in the darkness and bend over his books until the morning light made the flame unnecessary. His table, scarred by years of use before he arrived, now bears the careful arrangement of a scholar's life. His Bible lies open to the Gospel of John. "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Beside it, sheets of parchment covered in his careful script, responses to the charges that swirl around him like smoke, a small knife for sharpening his quills, an inkwell that he refills each morning from the supply his host provides. The room itself tells a story of simplicity chosen rather than imposed. The bed is narrow but comfortable, covered with a wool blanket that speaks of bohemian craftsmanship. A small wooden chest holds his few possessions, another robe, some undergarments, a prayer book worn smooth by countless fingers, and letters from Prague that he reads and rereads by candlelight. From his window, Hus can observe the daily theatre of Constance unfolding below. The square fills each morning with merchants hawking their wares to the thousands who have descended upon the city. Fresh bread, warm from the oven, calls a baker's apprentice, his voice cracking with youth and effort. The scent of that bread drifts upward, mixing with the smoke from countless chimneys and the particular smell of a city straining to accommodate far more people than it was built to hold. But it's the conversations he overhears that reveal the true temperature of the moment. Hus has learned to listen carefully as he walks the streets, his scholar's ear attuned to the subtle shifts in tone and topic that reveal which way the wind is blowing. The Bohemian, he hears a German merchant whisper to his companion as they examine bolts of cloth. They say he denies the authority of the Pope himself. The companion glances around nervously before responding, "Dangerous talk, that." Dangerous times for dangerous ideas. A group of students from the University of Paris huddles near the cathedral steps, their young faces animated with the passion of intellectual discovery. But what if he's right, one asks, his voice barely above a whisper. What if the Church has strayed so far from Christ's teaching that only radical reform can save it? His friends shush him quickly, eyes darting toward the cathedral doors where more conservative ears might be listening. Even the servants talk. Hus notices how they fall silent when certain prelates pass, how their conversations resume with careful euphemisms once the scarlet robes disappear around a corner. The winds are shifting. He hears a kitchen maid tell her companion as they hurry past with baskets of vegetables. "My master says to keep our heads down and our mouths closed until this business is finished." In the evenings, when the formal sessions end and the city settles into a more intimate rhythm, Hus often walks along the shores of Lake Constance. The water stretches away into darkness, its surface broken by the gentle lapping of small waves against the stone embankments. Here, away from the political calculations and whispered conspiracies, he finds something approaching peace. The lake holds its own conversations, the soft splash of water against stone, the distant cry of waterfowl, the whisper of wind through the reeds that grow along the marshy edges. Sometimes other solitary figures walk these same paths. A cardinal seeking respite from the day's debates, a scholar like himself wrestling with questions that have no easy answers, a merchant's wife taking the air away from the crowded streets. It's during one of these evening walks that Hus encounters a young priest from the Italian delegation. The man approaches hesitantly, glancing around to ensure they won't be overheard. "Master Hus," he says, his Latin careful and precise, "I have read your writings. I wanted you to know that not all of us disagree with everything you say." The conversation that follows is brief but illuminating. The priest speaks of parishes where the people hunger for God's word in their own tongue, of bishops more concerned with temporal power than spiritual guidance, of a growing sense that something fundamental has gone wrong with the institution they both serve. "But what can be done?" the priest asks, his voice heavy with frustration. "The system is so vast, so entrenched. How does one man, or even many men, change something so enormous?" Hus considers the question as they walk, their footsteps soft on the path beside the water. "Perhaps," he says finally, "we don't change the system. Perhaps we simply speak the truth, and trust that truth has its own power to work in the hearts of those who hear it." The priest nods, but his expression remains troubled. They part ways at the edge of the city, and Hus watches the younger man disappear into the maze of narrow streets, carrying his doubts and his dangerous questions back to his lodgings. Back in his own room, by the light of a single candle, Hus continues his correspondence with Prague. His letters speak of patience, of trust in divine providence, of the importance of remaining faithful to conscience even when the cost grows high. But between the lines, a careful reader might detect something else. A growing awareness that the forces arrayed against him are more powerful and more determined than he had initially understood. "Pray for me," he writes to his congregation, "that I may have strength for whatever trials lie ahead." The candle burns lower as he writes, its wax pooling on the wooden table, and outside his window, the city of Constance sleeps uneasily, dreaming dreams of power and reform, of truth and consequences, of choices that cannot be undone. Betrayal's shadow. December arrives in Constance with a bitter wind that cuts through the narrow streets like a blade. The lake, which had seemed so peaceful in autumn's golden light, now churns with whitecaps that speak of winter's approach. And in the corridors of power, another kind of storm is gathering, one that will sweep away the last vestiges of Jan Hus's hopes for a fair hearing. The change begins subtly, as such changes often do. You might recognize the signs if you've ever felt the political ground shifting beneath your feet. The conversations that stop when you enter a room, the invitations that fail to arrive, the careful neutrality where once there had been warmth. In the marketplace, where Hus had grown accustomed to polite nods from merchants and scholars, the atmosphere grows cooler. The baker who once smiled and offered him the choicest loaves now serves him with professional courtesy and nothing more. The bookseller who had eagerly discussed theological questions now busies himself with other customers when the Bohemian reformer approaches. But it's in the formal sessions of the council that the shift becomes unmistakable. Cardinal Pierre d'Ailly, whose sharp intellect and political acumen have made him one of the council's most influential figures, rises to address the assembly. His voice carries the weight of authority accumulated over decades of ecclesiastical politics. "Honored fathers," he begins, his Latin precise and measured, "we have before us a matter that touches the very foundation of our Holy Church. The errors propagated by certain individuals cannot be allowed to spread further, lest they corrupt the faithful and undermine the unity for which we have gathered here." The cardinal doesn't mention Hus by name, not yet, but everyone in the hall understands the target of his words. You can almost feel the temperature in the room drop as delegates shift in their seats, some nodding in agreement, others studying their hands with sudden intensity. The charges, when they come, arrive wrapped in the formal language of ecclesiastical procedure. Hus is accused of teaching dangerous and heretical doctrines that threaten the stability of the Church. His writings are cited, his sermons quoted, his ideas dissected with the cold precision of theological surgery. But behind these formal accusations lies a more complex reality. The Council Fathers face an impossible task. Healing the papal schism requires unprecedented unity among competing factions. The last thing they need is a reformer whose ideas, however sincere, threaten to open new wounds just as they're trying to close old ones. Emperor Sigismund, the man who had promised safe conduct, finds himself caught between competing pressures. His own political survival depends on the council's success, and increasingly, the council's success seems to require Hus's silence. The emperor's advisors speak to him in urgent whispers during breaks in the formal sessions. "Your Majesty," argues one, a seasoned diplomat whose grey beard speaks of years navigating such treacherous waters, "the safe conduct was granted in good faith, but if this Bohemian's presence threatens the entire enterprise, surely the greater good must take precedence." Another advisor, younger and more blunt, puts the matter in starker terms. The French delegation has made it clear they will not cooperate if Hus remains free to spread his poison. The English are wavering. Even some of the Germans question the wisdom of protecting him. "Your Majesty must choose one man's safety or the unity of Christendom." In the streets of Constance, the whispers grow louder and more pointed. A cloth merchant from Flanders leans close to his customer, a prosperous burgher from Augsburg, and speaks in urgent undertones. They say he denies the real presence in the Eucharist. Imagine telling simple folk that the Mass itself is meaningless. The burgher shakes his head gravely. "These learned men and their ideas," he mutters. "They forget that some questions are too dangerous to ask, some truths too sharp for ordinary minds to handle safely." Near the cathedral, a group of Dominican friars discusses the matter with the passionate intensity that theological disputes inspire in those trained to such debates. Augustine himself warned against the pride of private interpretation, argues one, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who has never doubted his conclusions. When each man becomes his own pope, chaos follows as surely as night follows day. But not all the conversations flow in the same direction. In a tavern frequented by university students, a different debate unfolds over cups of warm ale and the smoky light of tallow candles. "What if he's right, though?" asks a young scholar from Vienna, his words slightly slurred by drink and passion. "What if the Church has become so corrupt that only radical reform can save it?" His companion, a theology student from Cologne, glances nervously around the crowded room before responding. "Right or wrong doesn't matter now," he whispers. "The powerful have decided he's dangerous. In times like these, being right can be the most dangerous thing of all." The net tightens gradually, then all at once. Cardinals who had initially been willing to give Hus a hearing now speak of the need for decisive action. Bishops who had remained neutral now align themselves with the growing consensus. The machinery of ecclesiastical justice, once set in motion, develops its own inexorable momentum. On November 28th, barely 3 weeks after his arrival in Constance, Jan Hus is summoned to appear before a commission of the council. He goes willingly, still trusting in the emperor's promise, still believing that truth will find a way to prevail. He carries with him a leather satchel containing his writings, his responses to the charges against him, and that precious letter of safe conduct. He does not return to his lodgings that evening. The room where he had spent so many hours in study and prayer stands empty, his few possessions waiting for an owner who will not come back. The candle on his desk has burned down to a puddle of wax. His Bible remains open to the Gospel of John, the words seeming to glow in the gathering darkness. "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." But freedom, it seems, is a more complicated thing than the reformer from Prague had imagined. And truth, however pure its source, must contend with powers that have their own understanding of what the world requires. Outside, the wind from the lake grows stronger, rattling the shutters of the empty room and carrying with it the scent of winter's approach. Imprisonment and interrogation. The dungeon beneath the Dominican monastery in Constance exists in a world apart from the grand debates and political calculations unfolding in the halls above. Here, time moves differently, measured not by the canonical hours marked by bronze bells, but by the slow drip of moisture down stone walls and the gradual shift from grey dawn light to grey twilight in the single barred window set high in the wall. Jan Hus awakens to this new reality on a straw mattress that speaks of countless previous occupants. The cell is perhaps 8 feet by 10, its walls carved from the living rock upon which Constance stands. The stones weep constantly, moisture seeping through from the lake beyond and creating an atmosphere that chills not just the body, but something deeper, the spirit itself. The sounds of his imprisonment become as familiar as prayer. The distant echo of footsteps in the corridor beyond his cell. The scrape of the guard's key in the heavy lock. The soft splash of water dripping into the wooden bucket that serves as his only sanitation. Sometimes, if he presses his ear to the wall, he can hear the faint murmur of voices from other cells. Though whether they belong to fellow prisoners or his imagination, he cannot say. His meals arrive twice daily, carried by a guard whose face might have been carved from the same stone as the walls. Bread that tastes of sawdust and disappointment. A thin gruel that might once have known the acquaintance of vegetables. Water that carries the metallic taste of the iron cup from which he drinks it. The guard speaks only when necessary, and then in grunts that require no response, but it's the cold that proves the most relentless enemy. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and takes up residence there. That makes every breath visible and turns sleep into a series of brief escapes between shivers. Hus wraps himself in the single blanket provided, rough wool that scratches against his skin but provides blessed warmth, and tries to maintain the discipline of prayer and study even in these circumstances. They have allowed him to keep his Bible, perhaps out of some vestige of respect for his clerical status, or perhaps because his captors understand that hope can be a more effective torture than despair. By the weak light that filters through his window, he reads the familiar passages that have sustained him through years of controversy and doubt. The words seem different here, weighted with new meaning by his circumstances. The interrogations begin in the second week of his imprisonment. He is brought up from the dungeon into a chamber that seems blindingly bright after the perpetual twilight of his cell. The room is warmed by a fire that crackles cheerfully in a stone hearth, and the contrast with his cold prison makes the warmth feel almost sinful in its luxury. His interrogators are learned men, doctors of theology, canon lawyers, cardinals whose red caps mark them as princes of the church. They sit behind a long wooden table covered with documents, copies of his writings, transcripts of his sermons, letters he has written over the years to friends and followers in Prague. The paper trail of a life spent in service to ideas now deemed dangerous. Cardinal Dailly leads the proceedings, his voice carrying the patient tone of a teacher correcting a particularly stubborn student. "Master Hus," he begins, his Latin formal and precise, "you stand accused of teaching doctrines contrary to the faith. We offer you this opportunity to recant these errors and return to the bosom of Holy Mother Church." The cardinal's fingers drum softly against the table as he speaks, a gesture that might seem nervous in another man, but in him suggests the controlled energy of a predator. Behind him, a secretary's quill scratches across parchment, recording every word for posterity. Hus responds with the careful precision of a scholar trained in disputation. He acknowledges his respect for the Church's authority while maintaining his right, indeed his obligation, to speak truth as he understands it. "Your Eminences," he says, his voice steady despite the weeks of imprisonment, "I came to Constance not to defend error, but to submit my teachings to examination by learned men such as yourselves. If you can show me from Scripture where I have erred, I will gladly recant." But the interrogation reveals a fundamental disconnect that no amount of scholarly debate can bridge. The cardinals speak from within a system that has developed over centuries, a complex structure of authority and tradition that sees itself as the guardian of divine truth. Hus speaks from a conviction that truth must be tested against Scripture itself, not against the interpretations of even the most learned men. "You speak of Scripture," responds Cardinal Zabarella, his voice carrying a note of impatience. "But who is to interpret Scripture if not the Church? Would you make every peasant and merchant his own theologian? Would you reduce the sacred mysteries to the understanding of common folk?" The questions come in waves, each one designed to expose the implications of Hus's position. If papal authority can be questioned, what prevents complete anarchy? If tradition carries no weight, what distinguishes Christianity from the ravings of every self-proclaimed prophet? If salvation comes through faith alone, what purpose do the sacraments serve? Hour after hour, day after day, the interrogation continues. Hus grows thinner, his face gaunt with the strain of imprisonment and constant intellectual combat. But his resolve remains unshaken, even as the futility of his position becomes increasingly clear. Between sessions, he is returned to his cell, where the cold and darkness seem even more oppressive after the warmth and light of the interrogation chamber. Here, alone with his thoughts and his Bible, he wrestles with questions that have no easy answers. Is he serving God by maintaining his position, or is pride masquerading as principle? Is martyrdom a calling or a temptation? His jailers notice the change in him as the weeks pass. The confident scholar who had arrived in Constance has given way to a man worn thin by suffering, yet somehow refined by it, like metal purified in a furnace. When he speaks now, his words carry a weight they had not possessed before, the authority that comes only from having counted the cost and chosen to pay it. Outside his window, winter deepens over Constance. Snow falls silently in the courtyard beyond the monastery walls, covering the world in white, that speaks of purity and death in equal measure. The council continues its work, debating the great questions of papal authority and church reform, while one man sits in darkness below, embodying in his person the very conflicts they seek to resolve. The interrogations will continue, but their outcome is no longer in doubt. The machinery of ecclesiastical justice has found its target, and the wheels of that machinery turn with the inexorable certainty of winter itself, the martyr's path. The formal trial of Jan Hus begins on June 5, 1415, in the great cathedral of Constance. After months of imprisonment and interrogation, the Bohemian reformer is brought before the full assembly of the council. Hundreds of the most powerful men in Christendom, gathered under the soaring arches of stone that have witnessed centuries of prayer and politics. The cathedral itself seems to pass judgment through its very architecture. Massive pillars rise like ancient trees toward a vaulted ceiling, lost in shadow. Light filters through stained glass windows that transform the morning sun into jeweled patterns on the stone floor. Blues and reds and golds that speak of divine beauty, but also of the wealth and power required to create such magnificence. Hus enters this sacred theatre changed by his months of captivity. The confident scholar who had arrived in Constance has been refined by suffering into something both more fragile and more formidable. His simple robe hangs loose on a frame, thinned by prison rations and the constant cold of his cell. But his eyes burn with an inner fire that imprisonment has only intensified. The charges are read in the formal Latin of ecclesiastical procedure, each accusation weighted with centuries of theological precedent. He is accused of following the errors of John Wycliffe, the English reformer whose bones had been dug up and burned decades after his death. He is charged with denying papal supremacy, with teaching that salvation comes through faith alone, with claiming that the Church consists not of the hierarchy but of all those predestined to salvation. Cardinal Dai presides over the proceedings with the gravity of a man who understands he is making history. His voice echoes in the vast space as he offers Hus one final opportunity to save himself. Will you recant these errors and submit yourself fully to the authority of this holy council? The cathedral falls silent, You can almost hear the collective intake of breath from hundreds of observers as they wait for Hus's response. The political calculations are clear to everyone present. A simple yes would save his life, restore him to the Church's good graces, and allow the Council to move forward with its work of healing the papal schism. But Hus has spent his months of imprisonment preparing for this moment. When he speaks, his voice carries clearly through the vast space, each word chosen with the precision of a man who knows they may be his last. I cannot and will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither safe nor right. Here I stand. I can do no other. God help me. The words fall into the cathedral's silence like stones into still water, their ripples spreading outward to touch every soul present. Some of the assembled prelates nod grimly, having expected no other answer. Others shake their heads in what might be sorrow or frustration. A few younger clerics lean forward, their faces reflecting something that might be admiration for such steadfast conviction. The formal sentence follows with the inexorable logic of ecclesiastical law. Hus is declared a heretic, his writings ordered burned, his person handed over to the secular authorities for punishment. The words of condemnation roll through the cathedral like thunder, each phrase sealing his fate more completely. But it's what happens next that reveals the true character of the man and the moment. As the guards move to escort him from the cathedral, Hus raises his voice one final time. "Today, you burn a goose," he says, referring to his name, which means goose in Czech. "But from my ashes will arise a swan that you will not be able to silence." The prophecy hangs in the air as he is led away, leaving behind a cathedral full of powerful men who have just witnessed something they may not fully understand. The birth of a martyr whose death will prove more dangerous to their cause than his life ever was. The procession to the place of execution forms slowly in the square outside the cathedral. It's a somber affair, lacking the carnival atmosphere that sometimes accompanies such events. The guards wear expressions of professional duty rather than enthusiasm. The officials of the church maintain the grave dignity appropriate to such solemn business. Even the crowd that gathers seems subdued, as if sensing that they are witnessing something more significant than a simple execution. Hus walks steadily through the streets he had once explored as a free man, past the marketplace where merchants had whispered about his teachings, past the house where he had lodged during those hopeful early weeks in Constance. His face shows no fear, only a kind of peaceful resolution that speaks of a man who has made his peace with God and with his conscience. The stake has been erected in a field outside the city walls, surrounded by bundles of wood and kindling that will soon become his funeral pyre. The executioner waits with the professional patience of a man who has performed this duty many times before. Officials of the secular authority stand ready to carry out the sentence that the Church has pronounced but cannot, by its own laws, execute directly. As Hus is bound to the stake, he continues to speak, his voice carrying to the crowd that has gathered to witness his end. He prays for his enemies, forgives those who have condemned him, and commends his soul to the God he has served with such unwavering devotion. His words are recorded by scribes who understand that history is being made in this field outside Constance. The fire, when it comes, burns with a clean brightness that seems almost merciful in its swiftness. The wood crackles and snaps, sending sparks spiraling upward into the grey afternoon sky. Smoke rises in a column that can be seen from the city walls, carrying with it the scent of burning wood and something else, the particular aroma that speaks of sacrifice and transformation. The crowd watches in silence as the flames do their work. Some cross themselves and murmur prayers. Others simply stand witness to the end of a man whose ideas had challenged the foundations of their world. The officials maintain their formal dignity, but more than one face shows the strain of men who understand they have just created something far more dangerous than what they sought to destroy. As the fire burns down to embers and ash, the executioner performs his final duty, gathering the remains and casting them into the Rhine, ensuring that no relics will remain to inspire future devotion. But ideas, unlike bodies, cannot be so easily disposed of. The thoughts that Jan Hus carried to his death are already spreading beyond the reach of any earthly authority, carried by witnesses who will remember what they have seen, and by letters that have already begun their journey toward Bohemia. The field outside Constance grows quiet as the crowd disperses, but the silence is pregnant with consequences that will unfold in the months and years to come. The Council Fathers return to their deliberations, believing they have removed an obstacle to their work of reform and unity. They do not yet understand that they have instead lit a fire that will burn far longer and spread far wider than the pyre that consumed one Bohemian reformer on this grey afternoon in July 1415. The burning. July 6, 1415. The morning dawns grey and still over Constance, as if the very sky hesitates to illuminate what must unfold beneath it. There is something different in the air today, not just the usual mixture of lake mist and wood smoke, but a tension that seems to press against the stones of the city walls themselves. In the field outside the gates, the final preparations are complete. The stake stands like a dark finger pointing toward heaven, surrounded by carefully arranged bundles of wood and kindling. The executioner has done his work with professional thoroughness. The pyre is built to burn hot and fast, a mercy of sorts in a day that will offer few mercies. Jan Hus approaches his final destination with a steadiness that surprises even his guards. The months of imprisonment have carved away everything non-essential, leaving behind a man refined to his essence. No longer the confident scholar who had arrived in Constance, but something both more fragile and more enduring. His simple robe moves gently in the morning breeze, and his face holds an expression of profound peace that seems almost luminous in the grey light. The crowd that has gathered is larger than expected, but strangely quiet. You might expect jeers or celebration at the execution of a condemned heretic, but instead there is something approaching reverence. Perhaps they sense, in that mysterious way crowds sometimes do, that they are witnessing not just an ending, but a beginning, the birth of something that will outlive them all. Cardinal Dailly stands with the other church officials at a respectful distance from the pyre. His face is grave, showing none of the satisfaction one might expect from a man who has successfully prosecuted a dangerous heretic. Instead, he wears the expression of someone who has done what necessity demanded, but takes no pleasure in the doing. Behind him, other prelates maintain their formal dignity, but more than one shows signs of inner struggle. As Hus is bound to the stake with heavy chains, he continues to speak, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. Lord Jesus Christ, he prays, his words reaching every ear in the assembled crowd, I commit my spirit into your hands. You have redeemed me, O God of truth. The ropes and chains are secured with professional efficiency, but even the executioner seems to work with unusual gentleness. The kindling is arranged around the base of the pyre with careful precision. Dry wood that will catch quickly, larger logs that will sustain the flame. The executioner knows his craft. This fire will burn hot and swift, consuming its burden before prolonged suffering can occur. It is perhaps the only mercy available in this moment, and he offers it without being asked. A final offer of clemency comes from Cardinal Dailly himself. Even now, he calls out, his voice carrying formal authority, but also perhaps a note of genuine hope. If you will recant your errors, mercy awaits. The words hang in the air like smoke, visible to all and grasped by none. Hus's response comes without hesitation, his voice steady and clear. What I have written and preached, I wrote and preached from a sincere heart, as I desired the salvation of all. Today I will gladly die for the truth of the gospel. The words seem to echo in the stillness, repeated by the very stones and carried on the wind toward the distant mountains. The torch is brought forward, a simple thing of wood and pitch that will serve as the instrument of transformation. The executioner takes it with steady hands, his face showing the professional composure of a man who has learned to perform necessary duties without allowing emotion to interfere with efficiency. The first flames lick at the kindling with almost delicate precision, small tongues of orange and yellow that seem innocent, even beautiful in the grey morning light. But fire has its own logic, its own hunger, and the small flames quickly find their feast. The kindling catches with a soft crackling sound that grows steadily louder as the flames climb higher. The scent of burning wood fills the air, that particular aroma of oak and pine that speaks of winter hearths and comfortable evenings. But underneath it, something else begins to intrude, something that reminds every witness of the terrible gravity of what they are observing. The crowd shifts uncomfortably, some crossing themselves, others simply staring in fascination at the ancient drama of fire and sacrifice playing out before them. Hus continues to pray as the flames climb higher, his voice growing fainter but never faltering. Those closest to the pyre strain to hear his words, as if they contain some final wisdom that must not be lost. "Christ, Son of the living God," he calls out, his voice barely audible above the growing roar of the fire. "Have mercy on me." The smoke rises in a straight column in the still air, carrying with it the scent of burning wood and something indefinable, the particular aroma that accompanies moments when the physical world intersects with something larger than itself. It climbs steadily upward until it seems to touch the grey clouds above, as if carrying messages to realms beyond earthly authority. The flames do their work with merciful swiftness. What had been a man becomes something else, a symbol, a memory, a seed that will take root in soil prepared by centuries of discontent and longing for reform. The fire burns with clean brightness, consuming flesh and bone, but leaving something else entirely untouched. As the flames begin to subside, the executioner performs his final duty. The ashes and remaining fragments are gathered carefully, then carried to the Rhine and cast into the flowing water. The church authorities have learned from experience. Relics can become rallying points for dangerous devotion. Better to scatter the physical remains beyond recovery, leaving only memory and idea to carry forward the legacy of the man who has just died. But rivers, like ideas, flow beyond the reach of earthly authority. The waters of the Rhine carry their burden toward the sea, and the winds carry smoke and scent toward distant lands where other men and women will hear the story of what happened in this field outside Constance. The council fathers return to their deliberations, believing they have solved a problem. They do not yet understand that they have instead created a legend. The field grows quiet as the crowd disperses, but the silence is pregnant with consequences. Somewhere in Bohemia, men and women who loved and followed Jan Hus will soon learn of his fate. Somewhere in Germany, a young monk named Martin Luther will grow up in a world shaped by what has happened here today. Somewhere in the future, the ideas that died with Hus will rise again in forms his persecutors never imagined. The pyre burns down to ash and ember, but the fire it has kindled will burn for centuries. Echoes of rebellion. The news travels faster than any horse, carried on wings of outrage and sorrow from Constance toward the hills and valleys of Bohemia. In Prague, where Jan Hus had preached to crowded congregations in the Bethlehem chapel, the word arrives like thunder in a clear sky. The reformer is dead, burned as a heretic despite the emperor's promise of safe conduct. Imagine the scene in that chapel where Hus had delivered so many sermons in the Czech tongue, making the gospel accessible to common folk who had never heard God's word in their own language. The wooden pews that had held eager listeners now fill with mourners whose grief transforms quickly into something more dangerous. Righteous anger at a betrayal that cuts to the very heart of honor and faith. Master Jerome of Prague, Hus's closest friend and fellow reformer, receives the news in his study, surrounded by the books and manuscripts that had once seemed to promise a future of scholarly debate and peaceful reform. His hands tremble as he reads the letter, not from fear but from a fury so pure it seems to burn without heat. They have murdered not just a man, he tells his companions, but the very possibility of truth itself. The reaction spreads outward from Prague like ripples from a stone cast into still water. In the countryside, where Hus's followers had established communities dedicated to living according to gospel principles, the news arrives carried by riders whose horses foam at the bit from hard traveling. Village churches that had embraced reform now become centers of resistance. But it's in the deep forests of Bohemia that the most significant transformation begins. Here, among the ancient oaks and pines that have witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, a new kind of gathering takes shape. Men and women arrive by hidden paths, carrying not just their grief but their weapons, the tools of farmers and craftsmen transformed into instruments of holy war. The forest clearing where they meet has the feel of a natural cathedral. Tall trees form living pillars that support a canopy of green leaves through which sunlight filters in golden shafts. The forest floor, carpeted with centuries of fallen leaves, muffles the sound of footsteps and voices, creating an atmosphere of hushed reverence that seems appropriate for what is about to unfold. A preacher stands on a fallen log that serves as a natural pulpit, his voice carrying clearly in the still forest air. He is not a learned doctor of theology like Hus, but a simple parish priest whose faith has been refined by persecution into something harder and more militant than the gentle reform his martyred leader had advocated. Brothers and sisters, he calls out, his voice rough with emotion and the outdoor life he has been forced to adopt. They have shown us what their promises are worth. They have revealed the true face of their authority. The time for peaceful petition has passed. Now we must be the sword of the Lord. The crowd that listens represents a cross-section of Bohemian society united by shared outrage. Nobles who had supported Hus's reforms stand beside peasants whose only education had come from his sermons. University students who had fled Prague after their master's death share the forest floor with merchants whose businesses had suffered from ecclesiastical persecution. Soldiers who had served in various armies now offer their skills to a different kind of warfare. They call themselves by various names: Hussites, after their martyred leader; Taborites, after the biblical Mount Tabor where Christ had been transfigured; the Brotherhood of the Chalice, symbolizing their demand that laypeople receive communion in both bread and wine. But whatever name they choose, they are united by a conviction that has been forged in the fires of Constance and tempered by the betrayal of imperial promises. Their demands, when they crystallize into formal declarations, are surprisingly moderate, at least at first. They want communion in both kinds for all Christians, not just the clergy. They want the gospel preached freely in the Czech language. They want the church stripped of its temporal wealth and power. They want punishment for mortal sins, regardless of the sinner's rank or status. But moderation has a way of evolving when it meets with absolute resistance. The Catholic Church, having burned one reformer, shows no inclination to accommodate his followers. The Holy Roman Emperor, having broken his word once, finds it easier to break it again. The stage is set for a conflict that will consume Bohemia for decades and reshape the religious landscape of Europe. The first Hussite armies form in these forest clearings, blessed by priests who have learned to hold both cross and sword. Their banners bear the chalice that has become their symbol, and their battle songs blend hymns with war cries in a combination that speaks to the unique character of their movement. A rebellion that sees itself as a crusade, a war that understands itself as worship. Jan Hus, the one-eyed warrior who will become their greatest general, emerges from obscurity to lead farmers and craftsmen against the professional armies of emperors and popes. His tactical innovations, the war wagon, the use of early firearms, the integration of common soldiers into effective military units, will revolutionize European warfare. But more than that, his success will prove that the ideas Hus died for cannot be extinguished by fire or sword. The news of these developments filters back to Constance, where the council continues its work of healing the papal schism and reforming the church. The delegates who had congratulated themselves on solving the Hussite problem now find themselves facing something far more dangerous than one scholar's theological arguments: an entire people in arms, fighting for principles they believe are worth dying for. Cardinal Dailly, reading reports from Bohemia in his comfortable quarters overlooking Lake Constance, begins to understand the magnitude of what they have unleashed. "We sought to silence one voice," he confides to a trusted colleague, "and instead we have awakened a nation. Perhaps there were other ways this might have been handled." But regret, however sincere, cannot recall arrows once loosed or words once spoken. In the forests of Bohemia, around fires that burn as bright as the pyre that consumed Jan Hus, men and women prepare for a war that will last 15 years and spread across Central Europe. They sharpen their weapons and sing their hymns, and in their songs can be heard the echo of a voice that was silenced in Constance, but has found new life in the hearts of those who remember. The goose, as Hus had prophesied, is indeed dead, but from its ashes something with stronger wings is already taking flight. Departures and reflections. The autumn of 1415 brings a different quality of light to Constance, as if the very air has been changed by what transpired in the field outside the city walls. The leaves turn gold and red with their usual beauty, but there's something subdued about the season, a sense that nature itself is reflecting on the weight of human choices. In the great council hall, where so many momentous decisions have been made, the sessions continue with their formal dignity. But the atmosphere has shifted in ways both subtle and profound. The delegates still debate the great questions of papal authority and church reform. But now they do so with the knowledge that their decisions carry consequences beyond the comfortable realm of theological disputation. Reports from Bohemia arrive with increasing frequency, carried by messengers whose horses are lathered with sweat, and whose faces bear the grim expressions of men who have seen the future taking shape in ways no one had anticipated. The Hussite rebellion grows stronger with each passing week, transforming from scattered protests into organized resistance that threatens to engulf all of Central Europe. Emperor Sigismund, the man whose promise of safe conduct had lured Hus to Constance, reads these reports in his private chambers with growing unease. The political calculations that had seemed so clear months ago now appear dangerously naive. He had thought to eliminate a troublesome reformer and thereby strengthen the unity of Christendom. Instead, he has created a martyrdom that gives his enemies a rallying cry more powerful than any living leader could have provided. "Your Majesty," his chief advisor says, spreading maps of Bohemia across the table between them, "the situation grows more serious daily. What began as religious dissent has become open rebellion. Our garrisons in Prague report that they can barely maintain order. The countryside is in full revolt." The emperor studies the maps with the eye of a soldier who has fought campaigns across Europe. But these reports describe a kind of warfare he has never encountered, a conflict where ideas matter as much as armies, where the death of one scholar has somehow multiplied into thousands of warriors willing to die for principles they can barely articulate. In the marketplaces of Constance, the mood has grown more subdued as well. The merchants who had flocked to the city to profit from the great gathering now speak in hushed tones about the wisdom of remaining much longer. The Bohemian crisis has created uncertainties that make business planning impossible, and uncertainty is the enemy of commerce. "Mark my words," a cloth merchant from Augsburg tells his companion as they pack their wares for departure, "this is only the beginning. When common folk start believing they can challenge kings and bishops, where does it end? Today it's Bohemia, tomorrow it could be anywhere." His companion, a wine trader from the Rhineland, nods grimly as he secures his cargo. "My grandfather lived through the peasant revolts of his youth," he says. "He always told me that ideas were more dangerous than armies, because you can defeat an army, but you cannot kill a thought." I begin to understand what he meant. The departure of merchants and lesser delegates creates a different energy in the city. Streets that had bustled with activity now seem almost empty by comparison. Inns that had been packed to overflowing now have vacant rooms. The economic boom that had accompanied the council begins to fade, leaving behind a city that must reckon with what it has witnessed and what it has helped to create. But it's not just merchants who are departing. Some of the younger clerics, men who had come to Constance with hopes of participating in the great reform of the church, now find themselves questioning whether the path to reform leads through the corridors of power or through the forests where the Hussites gather. A young priest from the University of Paris writes in his journal by candlelight, "I came here believing that learned men could heal the wounds of Christendom through reason and debate. But what I have witnessed suggests that some wounds are too deep for scholarly medicine. Perhaps the Bohemians are right. Perhaps the only cure for corruption is fire." Such thoughts, once confined to private journals, begin to surface in conversations held in shadowed corners and whispered conferences. The execution of Hus was meant to end dangerous ideas, but instead it has given those ideas a power they had never possessed while their advocate lived. Cardinal Dailly, walking along the shores of Lake Constance in the evening light, reflects on the strange alchemy by which the council's apparent success has become its most troubling failure. The papal schism has indeed been healed. Pope Martin V now sits undisputed on the throne of St. Peter. The Church's unity has been restored, at least in name. But the price of that unity has been the creation of a new schism, one that threatens to be far more dangerous than the original crisis. The lake stretches away into the gathering darkness, its surface broken by gentle waves that catch the last light of day. Somewhere beyond the horizon, in the forests and villages of Bohemia, men and women are preparing for a war that will reshape the religious landscape of Europe. The cardinal had thought to serve the cause of peace and unity, but history, it seems, has its own logic that transcends the intentions of even the most learned men. As winter approaches Constance, the Great Council begins to wind down its business. Delegates prepare for their own departures, carrying with them documents and decrees that they hope will restore order to a Christian world that seems increasingly determined to resist such restoration. They leave behind a city that has witnessed one of the great turning points of European history, though few fully understand the magnitude of what has occurred. The wagon trains that had once brought hopeful delegates to Constance now carry them away, laden with the mixed fruits of their labors. Some wagons bear the formal results of their work: papal bulls, conciliar decrees, treaties and agreements meant to govern the future of the Church. But other wagons carry more troubling cargo: memories of choices made and prices paid, questions that have no easy answers, and the growing awareness that the world they are returning to has been fundamentally changed by what transpired in this city by the lake. The roads leading away from Constance stretch toward uncertain destinations, and the men who travel them carry with them the seeds of conflicts that will bloom in seasons yet to come. And lingering silence. The great council hall of Constance stands empty now, its vast spaces filled with nothing but silence and the golden dust motes that dance in the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. The wooden benches that once held cardinals and bishops, doctors of theology and representatives of universities now stretch in empty rows like the ribs of some great beast that has given up its breath. If you listen carefully in this silence, you might hear the echoes of all that transpired here: the formal Latin of ecclesiastical debate, the rustle of parchment as documents were signed and sealed, the whispered conversations that shaped the future of Christendom. But these are only echoes now, memories held in stone and wood, and the filtered light that illuminates empty spaces. The platform where the most senior prelates once sat bears no trace of their presence except for the worn spots in the wood, where countless hands have rested, countless documents have been placed, countless decisions have been weighed and made. The very stones seem to hold their breath, as if aware that they have witnessed something of enormous significance, the kind of moment when history pivots on the choices of fallible men who believed they were serving eternal truths. A caretaker moves through the hall with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to tending spaces where great events have unfolded. His footsteps echo softly against the vaulted ceiling as he straightens benches and sweeps away the accumulated debris of human presence. Scraps of parchment, a forgotten quill, the stub of a candle that once illuminated late-night deliberations. He pauses occasionally in his work, perhaps sensing something of the weight that still hangs in the air. This is a man who has spent his life caring for sacred spaces, and he understands that some silences are more profound than others. The silence that follows a great symphony is different from the silence that follows a scream. The silence that fills this hall carries within it the resonance of choices that will echo through the centuries. The afternoon light shifts as clouds pass overhead, casting moving shadows across the empty benches. For a moment, in the play of light and shadow, you might almost see the ghostly forms of those who once gathered here. Cardinal Dailly with his sharp intellect and political acumen, Emperor Sigismund with his dreams of restored imperial authority, the hundreds of lesser figures who played their parts in this great drama of power and principle. But most present in this absence is the man who was brought here in chains, who stood before this assembly and refused to purchase his life with the coin of recanted conscience. Jan Hus never sat in these benches as a recognized member of the council, but his presence shaped their deliberations more profoundly than that of many who held formal authority. He was the question they could not answer, the problem they could not solve except through the ancient expedient of elimination. The irony hangs in the air like incense from some invisible censer. The Council of Constance achieved its stated goals. The papal schism was healed, a single pope recognized by all of Christendom, the Church's unity restored. But in achieving these successes, the Council Fathers created new divisions that would prove more lasting and more dangerous than the original crisis they had been called to address. Outside the hall, the city of Constance has returned to something approaching its normal rhythm. The merchants have departed, taking with them the temporary prosperity that the great gathering had brought. The inns that once overflowed with delegates and their retinues now serve local patrons and the occasional traveler. The streets that once buzzed with a dozen languages now echo with the familiar cadences of the local dialect. But even in this return to normalcy, something has changed. The citizens of Constance know they have been witnesses to history, that their city will be remembered not just for the great council it hosted, but for the martyrdom it enabled. The field outside the walls where Jan Hus died has become a place of pilgrimage for some, of avoidance for others. The very ground seems to hold memory in its soil. In the cathedral where Hus was formerly condemned, the daily round of services continues with its ancient rhythm. Matins and lauds, prime and terce, the canonical hours that have marked Christian time for centuries. But the priests who lead these services sometimes find their voices catching on certain phrases, certain prayers that carry new weight in the wake of what has transpired. The lake itself seems to reflect the changed atmosphere of the city. Its waters, which had sparkled with promise when the delegates first arrived, now hold a more somber cast, as if they too have absorbed something of the gravity of recent events. The Rhine, into which the ashes of the martyred reformer were cast, continues its ancient journey toward the sea, carrying with it sediment both physical and metaphorical. As evening approaches and the light in the council hall grows dimmer, the silence deepens rather than breaks. This is not the comfortable silence of completion, but the pregnant quiet that precedes transformation. Somewhere beyond the horizon, in the forests and villages of Bohemia, the consequences of what happened in this hall are taking shape in forms that none of the original participants could have foreseen. The empty benches hold their vigil through the night, guardians of memory and witnesses to the truth that ideas, once released into the world, follow their own logic rather than the intentions of those who seek to control them. The Great Council of Constance is ended, but its true work, the reshaping of European Christianity, has only just begun. In the morning, the caretaker will return to tend this sacred space, sweeping away the dust that accumulates even in emptiness, straightening benches that no wind has disturbed. But tonight, the hall belongs to silence and memory, to the echoes of choices made and prices paid, to the lingering presence of all who gathered here to wrestle with questions that have no easy answers. The dust motes settle slowly in the still air, like thoughts finding their rest after long contemplation, and a seed sown. In the quiet years that followed the Council of Constance, as the immediate tumult of political maneuvering gave way to the longer rhythms of historical change, something remarkable began to unfold. The death of Jan Hus, intended to silence dangerous ideas, had instead given those ideas a power they had never possessed while their advocate lived. You might think of it as you would think of a seed, how the hard shell must crack and the living kernel within must die to its original form before new life can emerge. The reformer from Prague had carried his convictions to the stake, but those convictions did not die with him. Instead, they took root in soil prepared by centuries of longing for a simpler, purer faith. In Bohemia, the Hussite Wars raged for 15 years, transforming religious dissent into military innovation and social revolution. The farmers and craftsmen who took up arms in their martyred leader's name developed new tactics that would influence European warfare for generations. Their war wagons, bristling with early firearms and crewed by men who fought with the fervor of religious conviction, proved that professional armies could be defeated by those who believed their cause was just. But the true victory of the Hussite movement lay not in its military successes, but in its demonstration that common people could challenge the most powerful institutions of their age and survive. The chalice became their symbol, the simple demand that laypeople receive communion in both bread and wine, a practice the Church had reserved for clergy alone. It was a small thing, perhaps, but small things sometimes carry the weight of entire world views. The University of Prague, where Hus had taught and preached, became a beacon for those who sought to study the scriptures in their own languages. Students arrived from across Europe, drawn by the promise of an education grounded in biblical truth rather than ecclesiastical tradition. They returned to their homelands carrying books and ideas that would sprout in 100 different gardens. In England, where John Wycliffe's writings had first inspired the Bohemian reforms, scholars quietly preserved and copied manuscripts that official policy had condemned. The Lollards, as Wycliffe's followers were called, found in Hus's martyrdom a validation of their own beliefs. If a scholar could die for the principle that Scripture alone should guide Christian faith, perhaps that principle was worth living for as well. The printing press, invented just decades after Hus's death, became the instrument by which his ideas achieved their widest circulation. His writings, translated into German and Latin, spread through the Holy Roman Empire like seeds on the wind. Each copy made 10 more possible. Each reader became a potential teacher, each teacher a potential reformer. In the monasteries and universities of Germany, Young monks and scholars read these forbidden texts with the hunger of men discovering water in a desert. They found in Hus's words an echo of their own doubts about indulgences and papal authority, their own longing for a faith grounded in personal conviction rather than institutional compliance. One such young monk, studying in Wittenberg, would later nail his own theses to a church door and discover that the world was ready for challenges that would have seemed impossible in Hus's time. Martin Luther acknowledged his debt to the Bohemian reformer, calling him a saint and martyr whose death had prepared the ground for the Protestant Reformation. But perhaps the most profound legacy of Jan Hus lay not in the movements that claimed his name, but in the simple demonstration that individual conscience could stand against collective authority and survive in memory even when it perished in flesh. His refusal to recant at Constance became a template for future reformers, a proof that there were principles worth dying for and truths that no earthly power could ultimately suppress. The Council Fathers, who had congratulated themselves on solving the Hussite problem, lived to see their solution become the source of far greater challenges. The church they had sought to unite through the elimination of dissent found itself facing dissent on a scale they had never imagined. The authority they had sought to strengthen by making an example of one troublesome scholar discovered that martyrdom could be more dangerous than rebellion. In the end, the true measure of Jan Hus's influence lay not in the immediate consequences of his death, but in the slow transformation of European Christianity that followed. The questions he had raised, about the source of religious authority, about the role of Scripture in Christian life, about the relationship between faith and institutional power, could not be answered by fire and sword. They required engagement, debate, and ultimately the kind of reform that the Council of Constance had been called to provide, but had failed to achieve. The seed that died in the flames outside Constance grew into a forest of ideas that would reshape the Western world. In that forest, many different trees would grow, some bearing fruit that Hus himself might not have recognized, others remaining true to the simple vision of gospel Christianity that had sustained him through his final trial. But all of them drew their life from the same source, the conviction that truth, once glimpsed, creates an obligation that no earthly authority can dissolve, and that individual conscience, however humble its origins, carries within it a dignity that even the most powerful institutions must ultimately respect. The goose was dead, but the swan he had prophesied was already taking wing. Fade out. And so we come to the end of our journey through the streets of Constance, through the chambers where power was exercised and the cell where conscience was tested, through the flames that consumed a man but could not destroy an idea. Perhaps, as you lie in the quiet darkness, you might reflect on the weight that Jan Hus carried, not unlike the weight you carry in your own endeavors, the burden of seeing truth clearly when others prefer comfortable illusions, the challenge of standing for principle when compromise seems so much easier, the loneliness that comes with conviction in an age of expedience. The reformer from Prague faced his final trial with a peace that came not from certainty about outcomes, but from certainty about obligations. He could not control what the council would decide, could not guarantee that his ideas would survive, could not even be sure that history would remember his name. But he could control his response to the choices placed before him, and in that control, he found a freedom that no earthly authority could touch. In your own struggles, the difficult decisions that wait for tomorrow, the principles that compete with practicalities, the weight of responsibility that sometimes seems too heavy to bear, perhaps there is wisdom in his example. Not the wisdom of martyrdom, which few are called to embrace, but the wisdom of integrity, which all must choose daily. The Council of Constance believed it was writing the final chapter of a troublesome story, but history has a way of transforming endings into beginnings. The questions that died with Hus were reborn in new forms, carried by new voices, planted in new soil. The truth he died for found ways to flourish that he could never have imagined. As sleep draws near, let the silence of that empty council hall remind you that even the most powerful institutions are temporary, while ideas rooted in truth have a way of outlasting the structures built to contain them. The weight you carry in building something meaningful, something lasting, something true, that weight is not a burden to be escaped, but a responsibility to be embraced. The lake at Constance still reflects the changing sky, still holds the memory of all who have looked into its depths, seeking answers to questions that have no easy solutions. The waters flow on toward distant seas, carrying their cargo of memory and possibility toward shores yet unknown. Rest now, knowing that the struggles you face are part of a larger story, one that began long before you and will continue long after. Your choices matter, your conscience has value, and the truth you seek to serve has a power that transcends the immediate circumstances of its expression. The bells of Constance have fallen silent, but their echoes continue to mark the hours of a world still wrestling with the questions that Jan Hus died to preserve. In that wrestling, there is hope. In that hope, there is rest. Sleep well. Long pause as the story fades into peaceful silence.